"We're ready for whatever comes." Terrified, Hungarian nurses expected death until Americans chose mercy. The war in Europe was dying, but its death throes were brutal. Roads across the Austrian-Hungarian border were choked with the remnants of collapse, abandoned carts, bloodied bandages fluttering in the wind, and medical units stumbling through mud with no destination left to reach. Among them were Hungarian Red Cross nurses, their once white uniforms now stained grey and brown, marching on feet so blistered that every step felt like walking on broken glass. It was dawn, April 1945. The sky hung low and colorless, as if the world itself had run out of hope. These women had not slept in beds for weeks. Some had not eaten a full meal in 10 days. Their hands were cracked and bleeding from cold water and endless work. Their eyes were hollow, their movements mechanical, ghosts tending to ghosts. They whispered among themselves as they limped forward, voices barely audible over the distant rumble of artillery. "If the Americans catch us, it's over. They'll shoot us, or worse. Better to have died in the hospital." One nurse, barely 23, clutched a torn blanket around her shoulders and stared at the horizon with empty eyes. Another, older, tried to comfort a girl who hadn't stopped shaking since the evacuation began 3 days earlier. They had heard the rumors, the stories spread by officers, by retreating soldiers, by the propaganda that had poisoned their minds for years. American soldiers are monsters. They torture nurses, they take no prisoners. And now, as the low hum of engines grew louder, those rumors became real. American reconnaissance jeeps appeared on the ridge ahead, engines rumbling like a death sentence. The nurses stopped walking. They clustered together in the middle of the road, shivering despite the rising sun. Some dropped to their knees. Others held each other's hands so tightly their knuckles turned white. One whispered, her voice cracking, "We're ready for whatever comes." The jeeps rolled closer. Doors opened. American soldiers stepped out. Tall, clean uniforms, rifles slung over their shoulders. But no weapons were raised. No one shouted. Instead, a voice called out, gentle, almost cautious. "You're freezing. Come with us. We won't hurt you." The nurses didn't move. They couldn't. Trust and terror collided inside them, paralyzing every muscle, every thought. Could this be real? Could the enemy they had feared for so long be offering kindness? And what happened next is one of the most heartbreaking reversals in World War II history. If you love true wartime stories that reveal the unexpected humanity inside chaos, make sure you subscribe, because what you're about to see will stay with you long after this video ends. Hit that subscribe button now, and let's continue. The days before their surrender had been a descent into hell. It started with the evacuation orders, sudden, chaotic, impossible to fulfill properly. Hospitals across Western Hungary were burning. Oxygen tanks exploded in the night. Entire wards collapsed under bombardment. The nurses worked through smoke so thick they could barely see the faces of the men they were trying to save. They carried amputees on makeshift stretchers fashioned from doors ripped off their hinges. They dragged supply carts through mud that sucked at their boots like quicksand. They worked without sleep, resting only when their bodies gave out, slumped against cold stone walls or lying on bare ground for minutes at a time before someone shook them awake again. Hunger became their constant companion. Meals were reduced to watery soup made from potato peels and whatever scraps the retreating soldiers left behind. A single loaf of bread was stretched across 3 days. Some nurses went longer without eating, giving their portions to wounded men who needed strength more than they did. Their bodies began to fail. Hands trembled when holding instruments. Vision blurred. Simple tasks, wrapping a bandage, opening a medicine bottle, became monumental efforts. And still, they kept working. Because what else could they do? One young nurse, Anna, whispered to a colleague as they huddled together one freezing night, "We are ghosts, tending ghosts." It was true. They had become shadows of themselves, moving through a world that no longer made sense, caring for men who would likely die anyway, in a war that had already been lost. But they did it because it was all they had left. The terror that gripped them wasn't born from experience. It was manufactured. For weeks, as the front lines crumbled, officers had spread stories designed to prevent surrender. They told the nurses that American soldiers were savage, that they tortured medical personnel, that Red Cross insignia meant nothing to them. Better to die fighting than be taken alive, one officer had warned before disappearing into the night with the last functioning vehicles. The soldiers repeated the rumors, adding their own fears to the mix. I heard they execute nurses first. They'll interrogate you for days. You'll never see home again. The nurses had no reason to disbelieve them. They had seen brutality on every side of this war. They had watched men die in ways that defied imagination. Why wouldn't the enemy be just as cruel? The propaganda sank deep. It shaped how they saw every distant explosion, every approaching vehicle. It turned surrender from a potential escape into a nightmare they couldn't avoid. On their final night before capture, huddled together in an abandoned barn, the nurses spoke in hushed tones about what might come. Some prayed. Some wrote letters they knew would never be delivered. One nurse, barely 19, asked the question they were all thinking. Do you think it will hurt? No one answered. They simply held each other as the cold seeped through the walls and the sound of engines grew closer with each passing hour. Morning came too quickly. The jeep engines were unmistakable now, low, powerful, getting louder. The nurses gathered in the road, clutching whatever they had left. A torn blanket, a medical bag with nothing inside, each other. American soldiers stepped out of the jeeps cautiously, scanning the group with expressions that weren't what the nurses expected. They looked concerned. One nurse dropped to her knees immediately, hands raised, tears streaming down her face. Another tried to hold her ground, but couldn't stop shaking. A third whispered in Hungarian, "Please, whatever you do, do it quickly." An American sergeant, his uniform clean and pressed compared to their filth-covered rags, took a slow step forward. He moved like someone approaching a wounded animal, gentle, careful, aware that any sudden movement could cause panic. He stopped a few feet away and looked at them, really looked at them, at their hollow eyes, their cracked lips, their trembling hands. And then he spoke, his voice soft but clear. "We're not going to hurt you. You're safe." The words hung in the air. Safe. The nurses didn't understand at first. One of them shook her head slowly, confused. Another began to sob openly. The Americans lowered their rifles completely, setting them aside. "Can you walk?" the sergeant asked. "Does anyone need medical attention?" It was the question, more than anything else, that broke through the fog of terror. Medical attention. From the enemy. For them. The realization was almost too much to bear. The Americans moved quickly but gently. Warm blankets were draped over the nurses' shoulders, real blankets, thick and clean, not the threadbare scraps they had been sharing for weeks. Water bottles were pressed into their cold, shaking hands. "Drink," a young medic urged, demonstrating by taking a sip from his own canteen. The nurses hesitated. Some refused at first, unable to believe this wasn't some kind of trick. Others took the bottles but didn't drink, clutching them like precious artifacts they might need to protect. Then came the food. Rations were distributed, bread, cheese, chocolate, canned meat, more food than they had seen in a month. One nurse tried to hide a piece of bread under her coat, her eyes darting nervously, as if someone might take it away. An American medic noticed. He knelt down beside her, his expression gentle, and said slowly in broken German, "You don't have to save it. There's more." "I promise." She stared at him, and then the tears came. Silent, overwhelming, unstoppable. Around her, other nurses began to eat, and as they did, the emotional dam broke for many of them. They cried while chewing bread. They wept while drinking water. They sobbed while wrapped in blankets that felt impossibly warm. One nurse whispered to her companion in Hungarian, her voice thick with disbelief, "This cannot be the enemy." But it was, and that realization changed everything. The convoy arrived at the American medical station by midday. When the nurses stepped through the entrance, they stopped in their tracks. Clean floors, bright electric lamps hanging from the ceiling, rows of beds with white sheets, stacks of bandages, boxes of medicine, surgical instruments gleaming under the lights. It looked like a hospital from another world. For weeks they had worked in barns, in cellars, in bombed-out buildings with no windows and no heat. They had used torn clothing as bandages, sewn wounds with whatever thread they could find, and watched men die for lack of medicine that didn't exist. And now they stood in a place where supplies were stacked higher than their heads, where there was more morphine in one cabinet than their entire hospital had possessed in 6 months, where wounded men lay in actual beds, receiving actual treatment with antibiotics and painkillers and hope. One of the Hungarian nurses, a senior sister who had worked through the entire war, walked slowly down the aisle, touching the edge of a bed as if to confirm it was real. She turned to an American doctor and said in halting English, "You're wounded. They lived like kings." She paused, her voice breaking. "Ours died as shadows." The American doctor looked away, visibly moved. The contrast was overwhelming for everyone in the room. The Americans, who had grown accustomed to their well-supplied units, suddenly saw their privilege through the eyes of those who had nothing. And the Hungarian nurses saw for the first time just how completely their side had been abandoned. Over the next few days, something remarkable happened. The nurses were allowed to rest. They slept in real beds, under clean blankets, without the sound of artillery shaking the walls. Some slept for 16 hours straight, their bodies finally surrendering to exhaustion now that safety had replaced terror. They were given warm water to bathe, a luxury they had almost forgotten existed. They ate regular meals, their hollow faces slowly beginning to fill out, their hands steadying as nutrition returned to their bodies. And slowly, impossibly, they began to laugh. Softly at first, a small joke shared between two nurses as they washed their uniforms. Then more openly, as the weight of constant fear lifted and their humanity resurfaced. The American medics praised their skills. When they learned that these women had performed amputations with no anesthetic, stitched wounds by candlelight, and kept men alive through sheer determination, the respect was genuine. "You're incredible," one American nurse told her Hungarian counterpart. "I don't know how you survived." The Hungarian woman smiled, a sad, tired smile, and replied, "Neither do we." But they had. And now, for the first time in months, they could imagine surviving beyond tomorrow. A few days later, the nurses were called to a formal interview with American officers. The officers expected professionalism, perhaps even defiance. After all, these were enemy medical personnel, trained and deployed by the opposing side. What they encountered instead left them shaken. One of the nurses, a woman in her early 30s who had worked in military hospitals since 1943, stood before them, her hands clasped together, her voice trembling but determined. "We thought you would kill us," she said, speaking slowly so the translator could keep up. "We were told you were monsters, that surrender meant death, or worse." She paused, tears welling in her eyes. "Instead, you saved us." The room fell silent. The American officers exchanged glances, uncomfortable with the depth of emotion on display. Another nurse spoke up, younger, her voice barely above a whisper. "Our own officers abandoned us. They took the vehicles, the supplies, and left us to die. But you, our enemy, you gave us food, blankets, safety." She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "We don't understand." The ranking American officer cleared his throat, clearly moved. "You're medical personnel," he said simply. "You saved lives. That's all that matters to us." It was a simple answer, but it carried profound weight. These women had been taught that their enemy was inhuman, and in one act of basic decency, that entire narrative collapsed. The Hungarian nurses were eventually transferred to proper displaced persons camps. They were questioned, documented, and after weeks of bureaucratic processing, most were released. Many returned to Hungary to find their homes destroyed, their hospitals burned to the ground, their families scattered or gone. The country they returned to was unrecognizable, occupied, broken, reshaped by forces beyond their control. But they carried something with them that couldn't be destroyed. A memory. A moment when the world had been turned upside down, when everything they believed about their enemy proved false, when kindness appeared in the last place they expected to find it. One nurse, years later, would write in her diary, "Our enemy showed us mercy when our own world had none left." It was a truth that stayed with them for the rest of their lives. And it asks us a question that echoes across generations. When the guns fall silent and the propaganda fades, what remains is simply human beings choosing how to treat one another. Sometimes, even in the darkest places, humanity survives. Do you think kindness can rewrite the stories we inherit about our enemies? Tell us in the comments below, and if you found this story as powerful as we did, make sure you subscribe for more forgotten moments of humanity from World War II. These stories matter, and they deserve to be remembered.